Well, here goes nothing. Seems to be working. Hi everyone. It's Wednesday night, the night of the awesome 1,000 subscriber live stream on Electric Didact. You know me, I'm Jed. Um, you know, sort of, my companion who is off screen, but who might be joining us now and again as we go through the next hour or so, hanging out, reading some poems maybe, and thinking and talking about them. I don't know if anyone is on yet. Um, this is like a weird thing. Oh, Daniel! Daniel Holmberger's here. Hello. And okay, I'm not going to like narrate everyone as they join. That would be ridiculous. Cool. Well, you guys are like the vanguard here. I will be looking at, I have the chat up here to look at as we go, so feel free um, to say what you like. I might not catch everything everyone says because it is, I am trying to be a human in front of a camera in real time and also, you know, communicate via a tiny little chat box and also not mess up this this recording thing. So, well, hope you guys are doing well. I know for Daniel, it's very late at night, if not early in the morning. There in where he is. So thanks for joining. Um, I will not, as I said, narrate everyone's joining, but maybe we'll get a few more. The more the merrier, but that's fine. As you can see, I have my tea. I might, if you'll excuse the occasional impropriety, I might have to wipe my nostrils occasionally. It was 7 degrees this morning when I left for my job, my day job. 7 degrees Fahrenheit, I should say, I guess. After several weeks being quite mild, so it kind of caught me by surprise. We were away down south, a few hours south of here for the weekend, and then came back, and it was quite cold after being fairly mild before we left. So, all right. So basically, the idea here for this evening is very amorphous and tentative. When I did the Twitter poll, it seemed like the hierarchy of things that sounded fun were um, the activity that I suggested in a very biased manner of reading poems and analyzing them, talking about them. I have a window that I will switch to maybe now and then with some poems that I've seeded and that maybe we can mark up together and see how that goes. But then like next in the order was just like Q&A, talk, hang out, that sort of thing. So I feel like that's as as cool as doing poems personally. But yeah, so maybe see. So we have 5 people watching. That's sweet. Um, so I had a kind of goofy idea to start things off poem-wise. Would be just one for fun that I really like. It's from Odes to Common Things by Pablo Neruda, which means that these are poems in translation, which is kind of weird If you know the original language and the language of translation, it's hard not to like go back and forth and go like, that's that's not a good translation or whatever. But in any case, we can kind of think about them as being like two separate poems that are similar, inspired by the other. And maybe we can talk about um, a little bit about sort of what that means. I was doing some thinking beforehand on this, in thinking about poetry. Like one of the main things that poetry does is sort of remind us of language, and make language strange sometimes. Um, but I wanted to find there's this wonderful poem called Ode Ode to the Cat. These are all like odes to poems dedicated to like ordinary things like violins and chairs and tables and beds. There's one on the cat that I thought might be fun to read starting off. So this is Ode to the Cat by Pablo Neruda. There was something wrong with the animals. Their tails were too long, and they had unfortunate heads. Then they started coming together, little by little, fitting together to make a landscape, developing birthmarks, grace, pep. But the cat, only the cat, turned out finished and proud, born in a state of total completion. It sticks to itself and knows exactly what it wants. Men would like to be fish or fowl, snakes would rather have wings, and dogs are would-be lions. Engineers want to be poets, flies emulate swallows, and poets try hard to act like flies. But the cat wants nothing more than to be a cat. And every cat is pure cat, from its whiskers to its tail, from sixth sense to squirming rat, from night time to its golden eyes. Nothing hangs together quite like a cat. Neither flowers nor the moon have such consistency. It's a thing by itself, like the sun or a topaz, and the elastic curve of its back, which is both subtle and confident, is like the curve of a sailing ship's prow. The cat's yellow eyes are the only slot for depositing the coins of night. O little emperor without a realm, conqueror without a homeland, diminutive parlor tiger, nuptial sultan of heavens, roofed in erratic tiles. When you pass in rough weather and poise 4 nimble paws on the ground, sniffing, suspicious of all earthly things, because everything feels filthy to the cat's immaculate paw, you claim the touch of love in the air. O freelance household, beast arrogant, vestige of night, lazy, agile, and strange, O fathomless cat, secret police of human chambers, and badge of vanished velvet. Surely there is nothing enigmatic in your manner. Maybe you aren't a mystery after all. You're known to everyone. You belong to the least mysterious tenant. Everyone may believe it, believe they're master, owner, uncle, or companion to a cat, some cat's colleague, disciple, or friend. But not me. I'm not a believer. I don't know a thing about cats. I know everything else, including life and its archipelago, seas and unpredictable cities, plant life, the pistil and its scandals, the pluses and minuses of math. I know the earth's volcanic protrusions and the crocodile's unreal hide, the fireman's unseen kindness and the priest's blue atavism. But cats I can't figure out. My mind slides on their indifference. Their eyes hold ciphers of gold. Yes. Yes. Clap, clap. Or snap, snap, whichever whichever you'd like. What I like about these odes and some of Neruda's poetry in general is like you can see like the form of it, like the shape of the poem is really like thin. I don't know if you can see. Yeah. So like you have some lines that are just one word or something like that, which to be fair makes it hard to translate. It introduces problems of like syntax. One language to another, the syntax is often very different, and so when having like one word on a line makes sense in one language, it doesn't in the next, but still quite interesting. When I read the cat's yellow eyes are the only slot for depositing the coins of night, I couldn't help but think about Star Wars: The Last Jedi, which I've seen 3 times now, and BB-8 getting the coins slotted in them. And anyway, I won't spoil anything, but yeah. Cool. There are 6 people watching now. Excellent. Excellent. Great. So, feel free to, like I said, put anything in the chat box. I know I mentioned Q&A in the plan, amorphous as it was for this live stream, but obviously, or maybe not so obviously, I am just a man, and I'm probably not very interesting, so you probably have no questions. So what we'll do is we'll go to poems and see what we can do. So let's see if this works. So this is, let's see if I want to make sure that it switches. Great. So this is a OneNote notebook that I made for this evening. It has a bunch of poems that I thought might be interesting to read together. I've divided them very unscientifically, which is perhaps the best, into romantic poems and modern poems. The romantic era is, sort of like considered to be something like the mid to late 1700s through the 1800s, and then from then on you have more of another kind of era in at least the canon of poetry. Obviously eras don't really work, but it was convenient for my purposes. And so I have several poems here. I've got Emily Dickinson. I've got, I think, three of her poems here. They're Height in Heaven Comforts Not. Pain has an element of blank. Hope is the thing with feathers. And one by Edgar Allan Poe, who holds a special place in my heart, called Alone. And then a good number more in the quote-unquote modern category, including some Alan Brownjohn, Rebecca Morgan, Frank, which you may not have heard of, even if you like poetry, some Robert Frost, Gwendolyn Brooks, Nikki Giovanni, William Carlos Williams, E.E. Cummings, a couple by him, a favorite by Auden. So we got lots to choose from. We probably won't get through all of these, and the point is just to, just hang out and read and think and maybe discuss for a little bit. Let's see here. So Daniel says, translation is so hard. The more I think about it, the more I'm convinced it's actually impossible. And I think that's like that's I think that's true. I think Jacques Derrida is one of probably many theorists of language who have kind of come to that conclusion. There's like Derrida talks about like a irreducibility of language, that you can't break a language down beyond a certain point in order to like transfer or transform the pieces of it. And I think that's true. Once you try your hand at translating, I think if you do it enough times, you start to reach that conclusion. It's like it's Derrida calls it impossible but necessary. so so there's that. And I think that when it comes to poetry, and maybe we can talk about this, the added wrinkle is form, because poetry is to a large extent sort of defined by its form, and like I was saying with Neruda, it becomes a difficulty if you're trying to translate it. And a lot of times when I see poetry in translation, it ends up being sort of broken up differently, line by line. Sometimes the words are like in different places, just because it ends up not really working if you just do, a quote unquote literal translation. Someone asked, who's the translator of the Neruda? This is translated by Ken Krabenhoft. That's Ken Krabenhoft, for those who want to know, which is at least one person. But I think the idea of translation, where you have this sort of switching back here, when we talk about translation as being sort of an impossible thing because there is no like one-to-one between ratio between languages, and like even if there does seem to be like equivalent words, like the value of a word in one language and the value of it in another language system, they'll have like different connotations, different sort of connections with other meanings, when they're put into a certain context. And like that's what, to me at least, makes poetry translation interesting and fun. And what also makes it, in a way, like a separate creative process. Like you are literally, I suppose, writing a new poem on the palimpsest of the original, and that's really interesting and fun to think about. But it's much the same with just reading a poem. So I was reading an essay beforehand to kind of be thinking about this stuff, about poetry and like texts that are quote unquote open or closed, and that one of poetry's motives is to like is in the recognition that like language kind of always escapes us. You can't like pin down reality with words, but because our psychology, like our way of thinking, is so mediated through language, to the point that it's almost constructed like language, as some would argue. There's still like a sense that you need to try to figure that out, and so that's what poetry does in part. So I feel like the issue of translation is sort of tied with the issue of poetry in general. and language in general. I feel like it's all sort of all sort of connected in a really interesting and meaningful way. Let's see. Let's go back to OneNote. Let's see. I wonder if I can. Da, da, da. Yeah, and Daniel says totally the translator is the author of a new poem that builds on the original, and it's so true. Like, I when you're translating something, you almost feel the same sort of like at least I do. You feel sort of this sort of anxiety of influence, as some have called it, like where you want to actually like do better, do better than the original, or do better than anyone else could. Um, there's the because of the openness one language to another, you face the decision like every moment as a translator of whether to, at least a translator of literature, whether to like convey, the literal sense of the whatever word or phrase or line that you're rendering, or try to change it to something that may not be like quote unquote like on target, linguistically, like the exact the equivalent that's normally given for that sort of thing. Maybe something that captures the sense better to a hypothetical reader, in your own language, and then at that point you're like stepping over into the writer's shoes. There's like no way around it. It's kind of fun. But so Daniel says, is the translator's task to convey all possible meanings of the original? And that's interesting because, so I guess first of all, I think the answer must be no. Part of what makes a poem is the fact that you can't exhaust meaning in the words that you choose. So like on the one hand, every word in a language, for example, has this sort of infinite connection with every other word in the language, and can be combined with any other word to make any number of meanings. Once you put words into a form, like in a poem, you're putting constraints on what each word can mean, but you can never put an absolute constraint on it. Like there will always be what Derrida calls a trace of some other meaning or meanings than the one you intend. So in that sense, translation is like exactly the same as like writing an original poem, because you are putting down words into a form, and you can't control like where the meaning goes, for lack of a better term. All the poems that I have in... Someone has joined me.
Yeah, well, I just wanted to say that makes me think of when we were reading about Emily Wilson and translating the poem The Odyssey, and she had to try and choose a way to translate this idea that has been usually like translated all sorts of different ways, but many turned, and she chose to translate it complicated because it was such a complicated word and it kind of captured the essence better.
Yeah.
Even though it wasn't like literally the meaning of the word, it really kind of grasped the idea of
right. Well, it's like, and as soon as you start translating something, like I've been trying to translate ancient Greek lately, trying to learn ancient Greek and practicing by translating, and like you look up a word in the dictionary and it's got like, inevitably a word has like, you know, several, you know, different senses, different meanings, depending on like its context, and how it's used. But not all of those are like, well, in context A, it means definitely this thing. In context B, it means definitely only this thing. It's like they actually overlap and you can't like pin them down. So in that case, it's like there is no like literal, you know, translation you can do. Um, Sometimes people think, well, you just go to like the roots of the word, like the etymology, but like that doesn't always work either, because that's not how a lot of words have their meaning. You know, that sort of assumes that the meaning of a word is in its origin and its history. But like, if that were true, you know, there would be, you know, a word would have far fewer meanings than it actually does in the lived world, like the way people use it. So it's kind of an interesting thing. But yeah, it's a good example. So like we were reading this article about the first woman to get a translation published of the Odyssey, right? And so like there's this, you know, in the very beginning of it, there's the description of Homer, of not the description of Odysseus, and yeah, so it's like depending on how you translate the word, it affects
how you view him from the very beginning.
Yeah, it has huge ramifications, and so, um, and one of the things in the article pointed out, like, you know, all the men who have translated it before have sort of assumed that there's a certain way to go about it. But if you look at like all the translations going back, like almost no one translated it with the same word.
There were like at least 100 different varieties that they just listed.
Yeah, so
like a litany in the article.
Right, and so it's like, to those who say that, you know, there is uh, you know, there is some kind of definite rule about a given word, about how it should be translated, sort of is a denial of what is actually the case.
Yeah, I just really like that phrase. Like, let me tell you the story of a complicated man.
Yeah, right. Let me tell you the story of a complicated man. Like
this complicated man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Sorry, I stole your thunder.
Yeah, I'm complicated, but it's all on the inside.
Yeah. Okay, you can read your poem now.
Cool. No, thanks for the insight. That was cool. This is not a one-man show, everybody. Let's see. Let's turn this back a little. This is the first time using this webcam officially, so hopefully it's working all right. Yes, Super Mega Peanut says comparing a bunch of different translations of the same poem is fun as hell. Finding sometimes shockingly different interpretations of the original. So true, so true. It's pretty wild, and it's sort of like I just have fun with that sort of thing. And poetry, I feel like, is the sort of the most fun thing to treat that way. Like, you know, obviously there are tons of translations of individual works of prose or what have you, but and those can be nice, but it's fun to just take a poem, and because they're shorter and more interesting linguistically. So you and Heather are super cute, by the way, so Super Mega Peanut. Um, thank you. Time to sip my tea now. Okay, so I thought there was a way to... Aha. Cool. I have popped out the chat, so hopefully it will be a little easier for me to keep up with what people are saying. There's some cool peeps in this chat feed watching my smug mug on the webcam. Okay. So let's go back to romantic poems. So what I have is a, let's see if this works. I have a tablet in front of me that allows me to do things like draw. Maybe let's just start with this first one. So this is by Emily. Ooh. 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 I don't know. This is by Emily Dickinson. Interestingly to me anyway, and I'm not a Dickinson expert or anything, but like Dickinson's poems don't have titles per se. They're just, usually the first line. When you get an anthology or something like that, maybe we can talk about what the significance of a title is for a poem. But let's just read this one first. So, their height in heaven comforts not, their glory not to me. 'Twas best imperfect as it was. I'm finite, I can't see. The house of supposition, the glimmering frontier that skirts the acres of perhaps, to me shows insecure. The wealth I had contented me, if 'twas a meaner size, then I had counted it until it pleased my narrow eyes. Better than larger values, however true their show, this timid life of evidence keeps pleading, I don't know. There's a lot of cool stuff going on in this poem. First of all, like, there? Whoa, what in the world's going on here? I wonder if I can turn off the... Well, we'll just see how it goes. First of all, I don't know who this is. Like, who is they? Their height in heaven comforts not, their glory not to me. It almost makes you wonder if the poem has been truncated or something. But one idea that comes to mind is like the idea of treasure. Whoa. I don't know how to make it not do this stuff. In any case. One idea is like the idea of treasures in heaven, that there's sort of like opposed to wealth in the here and now. There's like a wealth of the hereafter, but obviously the speaker in this poem is sort of pondering whether or not being able to see wealth, obviously this being invisible, and the wealth that we have is visible. So you have this sort of theme going on of sight and invisibility, the idea that treasure in heaven is perfect, um, but that the speaker is here now, finite. This is kind of an interesting play. So you got I'm finite, which is kind of a play on infinite. So you got, it's a very meager difference, these two, and there's sort of like implied there, like something, whether something is present or not present is sometimes hard to tell. And then obviously, if we're talking about in the sense of treasures in heaven, as Dickinson is alluding to the Gospels here, you have um, treasures of your heart and treasures in heaven. So like, which is it? Is it in you, in the finite me, or is it on the glimmering frontier? And to the speaker of the poem, obviously, this is something in question, a supposition. We're talking about something that is hypothetical, maybe, and something that we can't see. It skirts the acres of perhaps, which I just think is just a cool phrase, and these things are connected. The frontier, as well, is is something. Hold on. These are all things that are by nature insecure, and then but we want our treasure to be something that is secure, that is assured. Um, so there's a neat like calling out here of like how um, of how things that are hoped for, things that are on the horizon, are always like always subject to contingency or insecurity or uncertainty, at least because um, we can't actually know them sensibly. So um, from here, from this discussion of things that are hypothetical and maybe that seem unreal because they are on the horizon, which as we talked about in my last video on Rogue One, is always something that you can't grasp. Like it's always ungraspable. But that's like this is the domain of hope, right? But on the other hand, there is a wealth, as the poet says here, there is a wealth that they do have right now. If it was a meaner size, and I had counted it until it pleased my narrow eyes, and from this point, from narrow eyes, which are not wide, which don't take in, don't take in the domain of the horizon. They're constrained. Woo! They're constrained by time and by distance.
And mortality.
And mortality, yes.
I feel like she's kind of recalling that scripture too about there are many mansions like in my father's house, and it's like I'm kind of that's great, but I'm kind of good with my current level of wealth because I
sort
need
of
the evidence,
right,
to appreciate it.
Yeah,
it's okay if it's just a little bit.
But on the other hand, like this last little bit right here, this timid life of evidence keeps pleading, I don't know. So like timid because it's physical, it's finite, and because it's limited or constrained, but also of evidence, so like sensible. Whoa. We think of, when we think of knowing something, we think first of all of knowing it empirically, of being able to talk about how it appears. But of course, if it's something on the horizon, a supposition, a perhaps, then it's insecure because we can't know it with our senses. Obviously, there's a lot that we don't know with our senses in the here and now, and I wonder if that isn't implicit here in this last bit. Like, I don't know about the acres of perhaps, but I also don't know even about a lot of the things that I could sense, you know? Um, so this last stanza sort of, I think, sort of introduces a note of ambiguity to something that up until now has been sort of positioned as something certain. Um, you know, over here when we're reading this stanza, we sort of get the sense that she is talking about something certain, but by the end, like, the I don't know is what we're left with, and I think the I don't know applies both to the here and now and to the unseen, to the horizon. Let's check the chat box again. So Super Mega Peanut says, my immediate reaction was how much the insecure, this word right here, stands out in the second stanza purely because of it not rhyming. At first read, you'd expect it to be insincere or something. So let's read it. The house of supposition, the glimmering frontier that skirts the acres of perhaps, to me shows insecure. Yeah, frontier and insecure are kind of like not exact rhymes. And that's right, it sort of does put some emphasis on the word, and hence the contrast. You have and supposition too as like the first line ending of this stanza. Like, this stanza is sort of framed by two words of sort of a negative connotation. Something that's supposed is kind of like, well, you haven't proven it yet, and oh, there's so many lines here. Yeah, definitely. Cool. let's go to another poem. Let's go to a quote-unquote modern poem. Let's see here. So this one sort of relates to what we were talking about with translation. So let's get this one to read. Rebecca Morgan Frank is a poem that I got to meet in college briefly, which was kind of cool. So this poem is called Dialectic, and it says the first lines from Riccardo Piglia. We yearn for a more primitive language than our own, but take in words with metered grace, swallow the garments they've worn. Mimic sounds, imagine we are known, comprehensible. City, I say, something granite forming in my mouth. City, you agree, glass blooming in iridescent shards of blue. Mammoth, I explain, woolly and extinct. Mammoth, you exclaim, syllables spanning a Himalayan peak, an astronomer's unmapped universe. And so we translate each other's wills out of subjunctives and indicatives, one wanting the other wanting something absent, unwrapped. As ears pressed to the ink, we wait, and the echo turns the phrase. So this is obviously a poem about language. The essay that I was reading before, I was talking about open and closed texts, was talking about the difference between a maybe like a semiotic understanding of language where words have meanings by convention, and a what do they call it? Like a numinous understanding of language, where like in the fantasy stories by Ursula K. Le Guin, Wizard of Earthsea, and stuff like that. Everything in the world has a name.
True name.
Yeah, true name, and like a secret name. And if you know the name, then you have power over it, and that's the basis of that whole fantasy universe is like magic system. And so the wizards weave spells by knowing like the aboriginal names of everything, or trying to figure out the names of everything in the universe. And so what that presupposes obviously is like that there are like objective things in the world that exist in and of themselves without our categorizing them and taxonomizing them. And there's the idea that you can have a language then that like is identical with the world. But this poem is arguing for a more conventional idea of what language is. So like you have this idea of where was it? The garments they've worn. So words is having clothes, and sort of you wear different clothes for different occasions and in different contexts, and then the clothes themselves mean different things to different people. That's why you wear them differently. And so it sort of hints at this like regression of I don't know how to sweet, we'll just leave it. So a regression of conventions. So like one thing meaning another thing meaning another thing. There is no like center or origin, but yet the poet says, we yearn, what? We yearn for a more primitive language than our own. And of course, the only language we have is our own. We don't have someone else's language. Languages don't belong to anyone. So it's sort of as it says down at the end, to say such a thing is an echo, a turn of phrase. It's just a, it's sort of a, oops, sort of an untruth that we can nevertheless imagine. But that going back to that essay, like this idea of yearning, the author of that essay actually compared this yearning to Faust, who of course makes a deal with the devil to get power for a day, basically, and then die. But he has like so much power, and of course it's like not worth it, or maybe it is, or I don't know. But Mephistopheles, the demon that makes the deal with Faust, says something like, as long as there are words being spoken, man thinks there must be some meaning to them, and that is the case even when you have like nonsense words, like like Jabberwocky. This is a made up word, but we assign a meaning to it. We assume that it has some meaning to it. But of course, if we just make it up, it doesn't correspond to anything out in the world, So anyway, that's kind of cool. I like the way this poem sort of plays with that idea and frames it as like something that we want, and try to achieve. This stanza kind of makes me think of Earthsea again, because it's like, they say the word city, and then something granite forming in my mouth, like it has effects in the world. It's sort of like a meta commentary. It's like saying what it's doing. As a poem, someone wrote that poems, like, unlike prose or other forms of writing, which I think is debatable, a poem has desire in it as a part of it. And you can see it sort of externalized here in this yearning. But, language is a cool and infinitely creative thing. And so, like, for each word, you got city, you got mammoth, then you have, like, connotations. But, like, the connotations are themselves words: glass, blooming, iridescent, shards, blue, granite. But like, are any of these things a city? Like, obviously not. So it's kind of a neat performance of that. Let's see. I saw someone mentioned E.E. Cummings. So let's do an E.E. Cummings poem. Cool, let's try this one. And this one, similar to the Emily Dickinson, does not have a title per se. the title given in anthologies or entries is just the first line. As freedom is a breakfast food, or truth can live with right and wrong, or molehills are from mountains made, long enough and just so long will being pay the rent of seam, and genius please the talent gang, and water most encourage flame. As hatracks into peach trees grow, or hopes dance best on bald men's hair, and every finger is a toe, and any courage is a fear, long enough and just so long will the impure think all things pure, and hornets wail by children stung. Or as the seeing are the blind, and robins never welcome spring, nor flat folk prove their world is round, nor dingsters die at break of dawn, and commons rare and millstones float, long enough and just as long, tomorrow will not be too late. Worms are the words, but joy's the voice, down shall go which and up come who, breasts will be breasts, thighs will be thighs, deeds cannot dream what dreams can do. Time is a tree, this life one loaf, but love is the sky, and I am for you, just so long and long enough. Whew. This one kind of bowls me over. I don't know, Heather. Any, so if we're going to just start with maybe impressions, like the weird way that Cummings, like, oh, what did I just do?
Done messed up.
Messed up.
Whoa.
The weird way that Cummings, like, combines words, hat racks and breakfast food and peach trees. There's a sort of play going on. Whoops. Talent gang. It sort of reminds me of like what kids do when they kind of figure out that
compound words are a thing.
Yeah, like they can combine words and make jokes out of them and stuff. It's or that words have various meanings, and so you can play with them like Lego bricks or something. There's also sort of a recurring like assertion that things are what they are not. So like paradox, like molehills are from mountains made. Every finger is a toe. Any courage is a fear. Impure, think all things pure. So like paradox. Like these pairings sort of like suggest that things aren't what they seem, or that there is you can say something is true when it's not, or false when it's true, and somehow either way, like it's right, like you can make it happen.
Does that mean then that at the end the speaker is not really there for you?
Yeah, like I don't know, like there's
but at the end it's like things are what they are. At the end of everything, it's
where was that? That was oh yeah. So which is it? If anyone has any thoughts on this, feel free to join in.
I think there's one.
Whoop. Super Mega Peanut says, "Worms are the words, but joy's the voice" is such a fun line. Definitely feels a bit like kids' wordplay, as you say. Yeah, I think I feel the same way. Like this line here is like something you would just make up on the fly because worms and words sound similar, and joy's the voice. You know, ois, ois, erds. It's like kind of chewing on the sounds and mishing stuff together. Um, I'm not going to make any sorts of claims about what this poem is quote unquote about.
Love. That's my claim.
Love.
Yes.
Love. Love is the sky, and I am for you. I mean, there is like, conventions about within like love poetry and stuff that like things get all crazy and mixed up, because you're like lovesick and stuff, and maybe, when you're in love, every finger is a toe, and any courage is a fear. What about this phrase, long enough and just so long, which repeats? Um, not sure how to interpret it.
Well, at the end it's reversed too.
So Daniel says, isn't there sort of a progression in the final lines of each stanza where they become surer and more real compared to the things that are what they are, not for the later stanzas? Let's see.
I can see that.
So, long enough and just so long will being pay the rent of seam, and genius please the talent gang, and water most encourage flame. So maybe here is a thing that I didn't really pick up on first time, but like being here is a noun. Being will pay the rent of seem, which is also being treated like a noun. So it's like two characters, like proper names, being and seem. And that sort of speaks to the whether things are or aren't how they appear. Um, just because a finger is a toe, being is paying the rent of seem, so it's kind of like
you can have a metaphor because it already is something else.
Yeah. Bloop. Bloop. Yeah. So maybe it's sort of also asking, like, seem is what's right in front of you, but being is paying the rent. And so, like, who's really in charge here? Seem is a bum, and is like following seem around everywhere. Like, hey, why aren't you paying your rent? I'm having to pay your rent for you, dude. But by the end, yeah, you have this thing where it says breast will be breast, thighs will be thighs, and that sort of thing. But everywhere else, you have
metaphor.
You have metaphor. You have A equals B everywhere, and even here.
Right, I know.
Love is the sky, and I am
for you.
For
so
you.
Are you really? Maybe the only thing he knows, because even at the end, you could kind of view that, especially in context, as kind of a sexual thing.
Yeah.
So that's the only thing that's real.
Just so long and long enough. And so you have like this, two words of long, but they don't mean the same thing. Right? So like just so long could refer to length or to time. You know, you have a piece of wood that's just so long, or you know, just so long as is like a conditional, phrase that we use. And then long enough can also mean like this piece of wood is sufficiently long for my purposes. Or you can say this has gone on long enough.
Right, because if you read it as an enjambment, like for you just so long, or not.
Right.
Because I didn't read it that way the first time.
Yeah. So I feel like no. Okay, now the more I think about this, like the more I think it goes back to this whole like drama between being and seem. You know, seem the bum. But seem leading being along everywhere, you know? So I don't know. I'm comfortable leaving it ambiguously.
I like freedom being a breakfast food though. Makes me think of life.
Yeah, like what do we make of this like first line? Reminds me of Wheaties, Breakfast of Champions.
Yes, Wheaties or life.
Or life, yeah.
I mean, it sort of like has a weird sort of logic to it.
Yeah, maybe it's sort of like the idea that you can yeah, if life is a if you can call breakfast cereals life, for example, then you can call anything a breakfast food. So this metaphor launches us on a whole series of metaphors.
Well, it's great too because that first one, I guess, technically, it makes the whole poem a simile.
A simile?
Yeah, because as freedom is a breakfast food.
Okay, right. Yes, as freedom is a breakfast food.
Or a giant analogy or something like that.
Yeah, I think John said something. John Bell says, "Oh yeah, and the entire structure after the last M dash is inverted, not just the so long and long enough."
Right.
Long enough and just so long. Just so long and long enough. And it comes last. What are we learning about Kyle Shaft?
The poems.
Don't know. Cool. Well, it's been a little over an hour. Time sure flies when you're taking stabs at poems that open up so many questions. But I think we'll probably leave it there unless we have any requests for a topic to square up or conclude that we may have introduced earlier. I guess I'll say one thing, or ask one question, or doing two things at the same thing is at the same time is asking about why poems might have a title or not. So this poem doesn't have a title, and the Emily Dickinson poems don't have titles. And it seems like a title has something to do with like signifying like a beginning or a purpose. And if a poem doesn't have a title, you know, what is it? It's untitled. And who wants to read an untitled thing? You know, you got to be like a diehard poet / reader to pick up something that doesn't have a title. So there's like a commodity aspect, like, you know, to have a title is to argue you should pick me up because this is a thing worth having a title. Whereas if it doesn't have a title, it's kind of like this isn't worth having a title. It's just a random thing. But
well, and sometimes the titles serve a different purpose. Like, so if you don't have a title, you're just putting this poem out in the world, and it sort of floats by, and people don't necessarily know what it's going to be. It's like those mystery dum-dums, and you don't know what it is. But then sometimes people's title is like the key to the whole poem. And if you didn't read the title, then you would be missing the last piece.
Right.
And then sometimes the title just connects with the poem.
Right. And so, like, hi.
Hi.
So, right, and so, yeah, some poems like that, like in some of William Carlos Williams' poems, like the first, so like, actually,
he doesn't put a title either, does he? Or I guess no, he does. His titles are important, like the.
Sometimes they are.
Wheelbarrow.
Sometimes they are, but sometimes the first, like the title is almost like the first line, and in order to read any of the rest of the poem, you have to read it like as it were a line, and that sort of almost negates the purpose of the title. But like one of the things that poetry does is like it alienates, like it puts language at a remove from you, whereas normally with prose, like the point is understanding and argument, you know, in a very explicit way. Whereas a poem sort of breaks down that state of affairs. And so like having an untitled poem is kind of on the same order maybe as like starting a poem in the middle of a sentence, you know, or something like that. So it's kind of destabilizes you as the reader. But I like it when it's E.E. Cummings. It doesn't. I don't count it as a disinvitation. So. Cool. Let's see if there's any final remarks on the chat box here. Lots of people saying goodnight. Good night, all. Daniel says, I like this poem. It keeps eluding the mind and yet seems to mean something anyway. And that referring to as freedom as a breakfast food. And he goes on, just spitballing here, is there an analogy in classical music not having titles but just being composers? Symphony number X. That's interesting. I feel like, so it's similar to like here on the Cummings and the Emily Dickinson poems, like when they're published, like they have to have something because of the publisher, you know, the publisher's demands, and so they'll like take the first line when it's a poem, or they'll just number the poems, like in my Emily Dickinson book, like they just number all the poems, which is almost exactly the same thing as saying, you know, symphony number X.
And you can't hear anything about it unless you call it like pathétique or something. You don't get any impression of what it's going to be. I think that's a good analogy.
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah, imagine an untitled pop song, Daniel says. Like, I would listen to an untitled pop song. And maybe that's like, maybe that's, you know, maybe the same thing's going on with poems that don't do it, or that don't have a title. It's kind of like taking something that we assume like there's a sense of authority that comes with a title.
Mm-hmm.
If it has a title, an author made this, you know. But a poem,
an author made this to be read.
Yeah.
And then if it doesn't have a title, it's like, oh, you stumbled upon me.
Yeah.
Huh. You intrude upon my world.
Right, and it sort of makes the poem sort of autonomous. But I think that's like part of what. That's part of like the struggle, the struggle of language in any literature is like the struggle between what the author wants, what I want as an author, as a writer, and what language allows me to do, and then once it's out there, what a reader wants it to do, and what the reader must do because it's language. And the title is sort of is like a maybe is the title sort of like a bastion or a hand grip. Yeah. Cool. Great. Well, thanks everyone for their comments and their participation and stuff. I hope that you all have a good night and that you have a good weekend as the week draws to a close here in a couple days. This was fun. Might do something similar to this again in the future, but we'll definitely. Oh man, John Bell says he found a Sigur Rós untitled song.
No kidding.
But is it really untitled because it's untitled?
Yeah, it is. Same as like E. Cummings or.
But at what point does like untitled become a title? I will leave you with that. Good night, one and all, and I will see you guys soon. I have another video essay in the works. It's the same one that was in the works last time I signed off on this channel, but you know, it's a thing. I'm working on it slowly but surely, and I will see you guys when I see you. Bye.